8. Michael Packard. The idea of being swallowed by a whale seems more appropriate for fictional stories like Moby Dick than it does for a true life story. But it does really happen, as one unlucky diver from Provincetown, Massachusetts learned in June of 2021. As a licensed commercial diver, Michael Packard catches crabs that are hard to capture in nets by hand-picking them from cracks and crevices along the ocean floor. He was about 10 feet from the bottom during a morning dive off Herring Cove Beach when his surroundings suddenly went black. Packard realized he was in the mouth of a large creature when he felt the animal squeezing him with its mouth muscles. He concluded that a whale must have swallowed him after feeling around for teeth and ruling out the possibility that he was being attacked by a great white shark. At one point throughout the ordeal, Packard began to fear that he would never escape. His life flashed before his eyes. He fought to free himself, and the whale began shaking its head from side to side. The creature swam to the surface and spat the diver out. Luckily, Packard's injuries were minor. Humpback whales are not very aggressive, and they rarely attack humans, leading experts to believe that Packard was swallowed by accident. The species feeds by expanding its mouth, which blocks its vision, further suggesting that the whale didn't mean to eat Packard. These types of incidents are so rare that experts estimate the risk of something like this happening at almost 0. 7. Nicholas Mevoli. In 2013, American freediver Nicholas Mevoli attempted to break the 72-meter world record for the deepest dive on a single breath of air, with no fins or oxygen. The competition was held in a water-filled sinkhole in the Bahamas, known as Dean's Blue Hole. Mevoli reached an astounding depth of 68 meters before he began to struggle. The 32-year-old appeared to turn toward the surface before changing his mind and diving back toward the seafloor. His fellow professional divers were noticeably uneasy about the dangerous decision. If Mevoli completed the dive, it would have been his second American record. After 3 minutes and 38 seconds underwater, he managed to surface. But he was unable to complete the final step of marking the achievement by stating out loud that he was okay. His speech was incoherent and his eyes were wide, and he lost consciousness and fell back into the water. The symptoms were scary, but not unheard of. Freediving is an inherently dangerous sport, and even the best divers are known to occasionally black out after surfacing. But medical personnel were unable to revive Mevoli. After 3 shots of adrenaline and over an hour and a half of resuscitation attempts, the diver was declared dead. An autopsy ruled that Mevoli died from the effects of an upper respiratory squeeze. It's a common condition among deep divers, resulting from the increased pressure that they're exposed to while holding their breath underwater. In simple terms, his lungs gave out. According to the autopsy report, Mevoli had experienced several squeezes before his fatal dive, making him increasingly prone to the condition. Mevoli's friends and fellow divers were devastated by his death, but took comfort in knowing that he died doing what he loved. 6. Natalia Mulanova. As history's most decorated freediver, Natalia Mulanova broke more than 40 world records and achieved at least 23 world titles throughout her 13-year career. The Russian national began freediving in 2002 at the age of 40 and quickly rose to the top ranks of the sport. Mulanova's career came to an unexpected end in 2015 when she vanished in the Mediterranean Sea during a private lesson with 2 students. The champion freediver disappeared roughly 2 miles off the coast of Spain after descending to a depth of 131 feet and becoming separated from her group. She was never seen again and was presumed dead after a several-day search. Mulanova was accustomed to much deeper dives, but the current was strong that day. She was also swimming without a safety diver, who would have been tasked with monitoring her for any signs of distress. She was most likely swept away and drowned. The tragedy served as a sobering reminder that even the best freedivers are vulnerable to the inherent dangers of the sport. 5. Alesia Zaki and Stephen Keenan. 25-year-old Italian freediver Alesia Zaki and Irish safety diver Stephen Keenan were brought together by their shared love for the deep sea. Zaki was described as having a supernatural gift for freediving. while Keenan was a legend in his own right, having trained hundreds of divers throughout his career. The couple shared an instant connection when they met at a competition in 2017, and they soon began training together. Later that year, Zaki attempted to freedive to an underwater arch inside the Blue Hole, a submerged sinkhole in the Red Sea near Dahab, Egypt. Her goal was to reach the arch, which sits at a depth of 180 feet, and then swim under it. A feat that had only been accomplished by Russian freediver Natalia Mulanova. When Zaki became disoriented after reaching a depth of 164 feet, Keenan began guiding her to the surface. Zaki surfaced, but Keenan blacked out at some point during the ascent. The 39-year-old was found floating face down, and attempts to revive him were unsuccessful. Dozens of divers have died at the Blue Hole, but the death of a safety diver is extremely rare. And as one of the best in the business, it seemed even more unlikely that Keenan would be one of the unlucky few. The story of Keenan and Zaki's whirlwind romance and the tragedy that cut it short were detailed in the 2023 Netflix documentary, The Deepest Breath, which highlights freediving as one of the world's fastest-growing yet dangerous sports. 4. The Bedford Dolphin Tragedy. Offshore oil and gas operations are maintained by professional deep-sea divers called saturation divers, who descend to extreme depths that often exceed 50 meters. It's an extremely dangerous but high-paying job, with most saturation divers grossing between $30,000 and $45,000 per month. To avoid a potentially fatal case of decompression sickness, also known as the bends, divers have to be extremely careful while returning to the surface. The high-pressure deep-sea environment causes nitrogen to dissolve into a person's blood and tissue. When a diver surfaces too quickly, the nitrogen erupts into gas bubbles, causing excruciating pain and other symptoms that can result in death. The need for deep divers to decompress came as an extreme inconvenience to the operators of large offshore rigs, which require almost constant maintenance, and where the equipment is located so deep that it would take days for a diver to safely ascend to the surface the old-fashioned way. During the 1950s, the U.S. Navy developed high-pressure chambers as an alternative to the need for divers to constantly descend and resurface. Saturation divers spend up to 28 days at a time living in these underwater structures, where the interior is kept at the same pressure as the water surrounding it. This enables the divers' bodies to get accustomed to the conditions, sparing them from having to undergo the decompression process every time they exit the water. At the end of their work assignment, the divers spend several days gradually coming to the surface. They stay in various diving bells that are situated at different depths as their bodies adjust. During a routine assignment aboard an oil rig in the North Sea called the Bedford Dolphin in 1983, an experienced tender named William Crammond dropped 2 saturation divers off at one of 2 pressurized living chambers. His diving bell detached from the chamber before its doors were closed, instantly bringing the pressure inside the chamber from 9 atmospheres to 1. In what's known as explosive decompression, the sudden change caused the chamber to blow up. The force caused the diving bell to go flying, killing Crammond and seriously injuring his fellow tender. 3 of the 4 saturation divers who were inside the chambers essentially boiled to death as a result of the sudden decompression, which caused the nitrogen in their blood to rapidly erupt into gas bubbles. The 4th diver was sucked out of the chamber and violently dismembered by the force of the explosion. For years, the Norwegian government avoided taking responsibility for the incident, blaming human error, while former crew members claimed that the disaster was caused by faulty equipment. The victims' families were finally compensated for their losses in 2009, and the Bedford Dolphin rig was finally retired in 2016. 3. Chris Lemens. While working in the North Sea as a saturation diver in 2012, Scottish national Chris Lemens and 2 colleagues descended to a depth of 300 feet in a diving bell to repair an oil pipe along the seabed. The trio were in the middle of fixing the pipe when they heard an alarm going off in the diving control vessel, who they were in constant communication with throughout the repair. They initially assumed it was a test, but realized that something more serious was happening when the diving supervisor told them to hurry back to the diving bell. The computer system that kept the ship in position failed, and it was moving away from the diving bell. While returning to the bell, Chris's tether to the bell and the ship, known as an umbilical cable, got stuck on a piece of metal. A tether is a saturation diver's lifeline, providing breathing gas, warm water for diving suits, electricity, and everything else a person needs to stay alive while working in the extreme underwater conditions. The situation went from bad to worse when the cable snapped, leaving Lemens in total darkness and with 5 to 6 minutes worth of oxygen. After being thrown to the seafloor by the force of the snapping cable, he had to feel his way around until he found the structure that the crew had been working on. By the time Chris climbed back onto the structure, the diving bell was gone. With barely any oxygen left, he accepted his fate and blacked out. Chris's colleagues, who had safely made it back to the diving bell, searched frantically for the missing diver. They found him 35 minutes later and assumed he was dead, but were shocked when they managed to revive him with just 2 breaths of air. By some miracle, Chris had managed to avoid death and brain damage. It's unclear how he managed to survive what seemed like the impossible, but he believes that the water's frigid temps caused his body functions to slow down enough for his emergency oxygen supply to last much longer than it otherwise would have. And while some people would never enter the water again after an experience like that, he continued working as a saturation diver. 2. Audrey Mestra. Audrey Mestra began training as a freediver after she met and began dating Cuban freediver Francisco Pippin Ferreras in 1996. The couple tied the knot 3 years later, and in 2000, Audrey broke the female world record by freediving to a depth of 410 feet. She set the record again the following year when she reached a depth of 427 feet on a single breath. In 2002, Audrey's record was superseded by freediver Tanya Streeter, who set the record for both men and women with a 525-foot dive. A few weeks later, Audrey set out to retake the #1 place. During a practice dive in the Dominican Republic, she reached a record depth of 545 feet. In her official attempt to set the new record, Audrey dove to 560 feet. After reaching her goal, she attempted to deploy a lift bag that would fill with air and quickly carry her to the surface. But her air cylinder was empty, and she soon became unconscious. By the time safety divers got the young woman to the surface, she was clinging to life and barely had a pulse. She never regained consciousness and died in the hospital. Ferreras was heavily criticized for organizing his wife's record attempt, which was underfunded, hastily carried out, and lacking proper equipment and safety protocols. But Audrey's death was ruled accidental, and there's no evidence to suggest that any foul play was involved. 1. Dion Dreer and David Shaw. South African scuba diver Dion Dreer jumped at the opportunity to explore a deepwater cave known as Bushman's Hole in 1994. Located in the country's northern Cape region, the submerged cave is notorious for the number of divers who have died exploring it. Dreer unfortunately became a statistic during a practice dive, when his teammates noticed that his body was rapidly sinking toward the bottom of the 927-foot deep hole. Knowing that trying to retrieve him would essentially equate to a death wish, Dreer's fellow divers had no choice but to return to the surface without him. Dreer most likely suffered from a deep-water blackout, but without his body, there was no way of knowing for sure. After several attempts to retrieve his remains, authorities gave up. 10 years later, in 2004, a cave diver named David Shaw made it his personal mission to recover Dreer's body. He descended more than 800 feet and detached from his cable to search. Shaw found Dreer's body, but he didn't have the proper equipment to bring it to the surface. In early 2005, he returned with a team of divers and attempted to recover the body. Despite taking ample safety precautions, a vital piece of equipment broke while the team hastily left the site, leaving behind some equipment and both Shaw and Dreer's bodies. When they returned for the equipment, they discovered that both bodies had floated up near the surface. the remains of both men were recovered, marking the sad end to Shaw's ill-fated recovery effort. Thanks for watching. Do you have any crazy diving stories of your own? Tell us about them in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.